From sunrise to sunset, recycling is more than a job. It's a way of life. Early mornings, late nights, hard work that turns the old into something new. Recyclers power the economy, and ReMatter is built to power you. Making those long days easier with smarter tools like scale ticketing, payments, dispatch, and everything in between. We bring it all together so you can focus on what matters most, growing your business and serving your community. Driven by the spirit of recyclers everywhere. ReMatter. Built for recycling. Built for you.
All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to this afternoon's session, Navigating North American Trade and Beyond, a shift in the political landscape. First, I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to thank our sponsors. I have a couple administrative things. Are there any press in the room? If you could please raise your hand. Okay, I see a couple. Please just take a minute to note where the emergency exits are. There's some on the side, in the back, and also behind the stage if you need them. We're going to go for about 45 minutes and then allow time for questions. So there's going to be an extensive question and answer time period, and there'll be microphones in the front for that. Well, sometimes over the years when I've spoken or moderated panels at the convention, I've had to really encourage people to show up because the topic was on international trade. And it was this obscure thing that's very small amount of people cared about. Now it seems to be the most prevalent issue in the news, front page of the Wall Street Journal, front page of the New York Times, it's everywhere. And it's affecting our business in a very special way. I have an outstanding guest speaker in Nazak Nikakhtar from the Wiley firm. And I've worked with Nazak for probably over 5 years. A little bit about myself before I introduce Nazak. But I recently retired from Nucor Corporation and the David Joseph Company. I was the general counsel at DJJ, and I worked in the legal team at Nucor. And one of the things they asked me to do was international trade litigation. And in that process, I worked with the Wiley firm, and they're known as the best trade firm in Washington, D.C. So I had the privilege to work with them and get to know Nazak there when we helped Nucor navigate dumping and foreign countries subsidizing steel and dumping it in the U.S., and we would file various actions and we'd work on policy matters. But now, fortunately, we've been able to get the Wiley firm to assist ReMA in its trade activities, and really it's been quite an interesting time over the past 3 months. A little bit about Nazak. She has over 2 decades of experience in international trade and national security. Most recently, she was the Department of Commerce's Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration, where she was also the department's lead on the Committee of Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS. And while for the U.S. government, Nazak played a pivotal role in enhancing U.S. industry competitiveness and national security by shaping policies related to critical technologies and supply chains. So welcome, Nazak, to ReMA's annual convention. I'm going to start with the format's going to be a little bit of a fireside chat where I ask Nazak some questions and maybe we go back and forth a little bit on the topic and then move on to the next one. So Nazak, I can't remember any administration in my lifetime that has been so aggressive and broad-based in its trade activities in such a short period of time. And based upon your experience in the U.S. government and also as a trade expert advising a variety of industries, can you share your thoughts on the current administration's goals and strategies?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you. And Chris is being modest, but his efforts were tremendous in leveling the playing field for American industries and really putting forth innovative solutions that made America rethink how we can approach trade to make sure that our manufacturing industries are healthy. So you've done a tremendous job in your time in this trade space, Chris. I'm going to talk as somebody who's watching this all the time and as a former senior official in Trump 45. There is a lot happening right now, and I think everybody, every minute of every day, some news seems to break about the Trump administration's going this way. No, we're reversing course and we're going this way. And what does that mean for your business? But I think it's really helpful to understand all of this and sort of the objectives of the president and his administration. And I'll start by just saying that he really fundamentally, with respect to all of our trading partners, he doesn't really look at who's necessarily worse than the others. He just views them all in the same camp, which is you foreign country, your practices have undermined American industry competitiveness, whether it's subsidizing, whether it's dumping goods, whether it's non-market economic distortions, and I'm going to now get the advantage back for America, right? And what does that get the advantage back mean? It's not protectionism. It's, look, I'm going to push for fair trade because we need fair trade to get our industries up and running. We want to onshore American manufacturing. We want to bring back jobs, focused very much on American technological leadership, America's economic strength broadly, revenue generation, right? That's part of what the administration is pursuing tariffs for, is to generate revenue. And then to really exert power and influence globally, both economic and military. And part of what the administration is also trying to do is it's really recognizing that it's unsustainable for the United States to help all of our allies in terms of the not just defense, but the things that they need that we're all dependent on China for. So part of it is also pushing our allies, our trading partners, to become a little bit more sustaining in terms of what they need. Because the reality is that we can't supply everybody with everything what they need, but very much also focusing on, let's build up American manufacturing, and to the extent we can, make sure that our defense industrial base, our commercial industrial bases are resilient, and to some extent support our allies with the things like critical minerals that they will need. And the president has also seen through decades and decades of evidence that tariffs seem to accomplish this. They help strengthen the industry. They help strengthen the level the playing field. They bring in revenue, right? And he's also saying, we should be more aggressive. America should be more aggressive in how we leverage tariffs because, like the president has said all the time, it's a privilege to access U.S. markets. And I want to distill that a little bit. It's beyond that. He's essentially saying that America has had all of these, you do business in America, there's legal protections, right? There's IP protections. We have open borders. You can invest freely in America. And so now it's a privilege. It's not a right because we've been displaced in other markets. So if you've displaced us from your markets, you're going to have to pay to come in here. He's not always really detailed in how he speaks, but that's really the genesis of where he's going with this. Really focused on American leadership in the world, American strength, and it all starts from American manufacturing jobs and the revenue that America can generate from tariffs to really pour into the defense industrial base. And I want to really emphasize this last point. The Trump administration is very keen on making it easier for companies to operate, both through deregulation and also to use the levers in the US government to help fund some of the critical capabilities we need.
That's a really good overview, Nazak. And the recycling industry, we have rebranded, and we focus a lot on the fact that we provide essential raw materials for manufacturing. And we're ready, the members of ReMA are ready to provide those raw materials to the manufacturing process, but also to service manufacturers as they produce what we used to call scrap materials, but recyclable items that then we can turn into raw materials to go back into the system. Now, do you think the current administration understands how the recycling industry fits into manufacturing, and including the defense industrial base, and how does that affect their strategy, and how do you see the recycling industry being impacted by the strategy you just described?
That's a great question because given the importance of the recycling industry, there really isn't a great understanding in the administration about how the American recycling industry is so foundational to our critical capabilities, the defense industrial base, the commercial industrial base. So there's an education campaign and an awareness campaign. However, you also do see initiatives come up where the recycling industry will have a lot to say. Something I failed to mention a few minutes ago that's really important is also the administration just looks at this time horizon where things are getting a little tense with China. We have a weak industrial base. There's so many critical capabilities that we need. And so the reason you see sort of frenzied action is because this understanding and this real feeling of a lack of time. So you see a lot of these sort of different legal authorities being used to throw tariffs on everything. And some of it is going to impact the recycling industry, whether it's directly through the trade actions by the Trump administration, right? There's the Copper 232, that part of it really for the first time in these national security import restrictive investigations is this notion to restrict exports. There's a potential that we might see more and more of that now that it's sort of become a template of how these investigations might work. But there's also this potential for retaliation. Even if we don't restrict our own exports, Chris, but we restrict imports from other countries, will they retaliate against us and block our ability to export recycled materials, other things to them? And then what does that mean for the strength of our industry? And it's this sort of circular system, I think, that on one hand, it's obvious policymakers understand that it's happening, but it hasn't risen to the level that it needs to be considered in all of their policy options. And I think ReMA is doing this and stands to do much more of it now that all of this tit-for-tat actions are taking place, to really underscore how important it is that we keep all of our measures, we keep the recycling industry resilient, and we make sure that we're insulating the recycling industry for some of our trading partners' retaliatory actions.
Yeah, and I'd like to ask you a little bit more about the Copper 232 investigation. And we've had 232 investigations, and it's a national security underpinning for steel and aluminum, and it's solely focused on imports of steel and aluminum coming into America that were damaging domestic industry. Therefore, the government put the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum coming into the US. The copper one's very different. Yes, it calls for that, the investigation, but the investigation also is asking whether there should be export restrictions, which could be export bans, on the ability of copper scrap, copper bearing scrap, to leave the US. And we haven't seen that in a 232 before. And I know we had some good meetings. You were there, and I think Robin and Adam were there, meeting with the Department of Commerce. I know ReMA provided very extensive comments on the record about why export restrictions were a bad idea and the economic rationale for that. But can you talk a little bit about how that meeting went and how those arguments are starting to help at least the Department of Commerce understand the importance of the recycling industry?
Yeah, so it's really important for everybody to understand that in any administration, you have officials coming in who had previous jobs, and those jobs were informed by the industries that they dealt with. And so I think how this copper investigation arose, and we'll touch on the investigation, was folks in the administration had sort of one sense of an understanding of what this copper recycling industry looked like, and kind of with that understanding came in and felt really compelled to solve a problem and put forward a solution that seems to maybe, at least offered a solution that maybe seems to not make sense. This was all done through this context of a Section 232 investigation. And I should say that in Trump 45, the first Trump administration, Chris, demonstrated so much leadership in making the US government understand that there really was this global overcapacity problem that really merited the use of laws that we have in innovative ways, which was to restrict imports into the United States of steel and aluminum because of the overcapacity and how it was distorting the global marketplace. The dynamics are different in the copper industry, right? And ReMA put forward really extensive comments, Chris, as you mentioned that, but really full of data, because there's one thing of advocating with the government, is another thing of proving, right, your point that you were right. And the narrative there was so fascinating and so unlike, I think, anything that the government contemplated, was that we recycle more copper than we know what to do with, right? And so we export that, and the export is really important to have a trade surplus with the country and have countries reliant on the United States for a change rather than vice versa. And I think the government, and then we followed up with having a meeting with the government, and I think the government really started understanding the notion that, look, if demand one day for copper, domestic demand for copper one day, exceeds, right, what we consume domestically, such that we need to limit some of our exports and consume it here, the price premium in the United States is really going to take care of that, right? We don't need the government to intervene in this market. But right now, why not use some of our U.S. manufacturing diplomacy by exporting to the rest of the world, not only for revenue generation, but also, you know, flex the muscle, show that America is a global player, right? There's so much a narrative right now about America becoming isolationist, but the more we're able to produce and export to the rest of the world, that also underscores our commitment, American industry's commitment to maintaining trading relationships. So on a number of levels, ReMA's position was so important, so compelling. I think the government understands it. I think that really, frankly, the government didn't really understand, Chris, to your earlier point about the recycling industry, and certainly copper. And I think the more they're looking at it, the more they're convinced that maybe export restrictions doesn't make sense in this context. So we'll see. This investigation, national security investigation, is going to take months to conclude. But I think so far we're on solid footing. However, there's still a massive education campaign. The government really doesn't understand the recycling industry. And then there's some biases from, you know, maybe the last administration about sort of recycling only being limited to climate change, energy transition, but the reality is that what you're doing is so much more than that. It's really supporting the domestic industrial base, and that's a narrative that the government hasn't heard more of, and I think it's really important that they do. And this 232 investigation is their first step in being exposed to this.
Yeah, every opportunity we have to enlighten the government and the new administration as to the benefits and the criticality of recycling is really valuable. We had our fly-in in February. We had over 100 meetings on the Hill explaining about how essential our industry is and how we provide the raw materials to make manufacturing work. So we can't stop. We can't stop. We have to keep that message going. There's been a ton of things happening in the press every day. Last week it was the UK agreement. Yesterday it was the China agreement. At the earlier session this morning, I think one of the speakers said, well, I can only plan 1 to 3 days, forget about 1 to 3 years. There's so much change that's happening. Can you just maybe explain your thoughts on both the UK deal and the China deal, and maybe what you might see coming down the pipe with some of the other countries that are going to be negotiating with the administration?
Yeah, so Trump kind of came in, right, to this administration with this really fundamental sense of just unfairness, right? America has been treated so unfairly for so long. And, you know, everybody, I think, with respect to their particular companies, you may see a sliver of it. But here's somebody who's just come in and has been, at least certainly through his first term, seen more than he's ever seen before about how global trade has been distorted against America's interests in his viewpoint, and how he just has limited time to fix it. So that's why you saw just a race towards just tariffing everybody, and then looking to figure out where we can make deals. And the deals are important to underscore that the administration isn't trying to be protectionist, right? They've said this a number of times. It's negotiating leverage, but I think it's more than negotiating leverage. I think it's saying, listen, you've been harming America's interests so long, I'm gonna harm you until I get you to the table and we can have fair discussions. That's why the deal with the UK was so significant. Now, we didn't have that many problems with the UK to begin with. Sure, they do some things that are unfair, and they have tariff and non-tariff barriers, but generally the trading relationship is good. But what was so significant about the deal is that it gave the UK quite a bit of access to the US market through the reduction of autos tariffs, the steel and aluminum, but by virtue of reduction, I'm saying that the baseline 10% tariffs remain, but the president reduced these other 232 tariffs that the UK was subject to. But it also, the UK gave us greater market access for our agriculture products and other products. That's important is because it slightly improved the status quo. The status quo was unfair access. It slightly improved that, but it really signaled to the world that the United States isn't just trying to put tariffs on just for the sake of tariffs. It's really trying to achieve an outcome, which is also why I thought the Saudi Arabian deal was a big deal that was just announced. Because Saudi Arabia is really trying to partner with a high-tech country to build out their own capabilities. And if the US isn't there, their only alternative is China, right? And so the Saudi deal, $600 billion of investments, more purchases from US companies. And I say that also to remember that this is a good advocacy point for all of you. The president and his team are looking to get countries to kind of correct some of their prior harms by buying more goods. So think about that. That actually goes into the narrative that we've been suggesting, which is US exports are good. But the Saudi Arabian deal was a way to sort of pull partners closer to us and get them away from China. Now the China, the China agreement. I think folks had mixed feelings. I think Trump really didn't realize the extent of China's retaliation. He felt, because of fentanyl and because of the huge range of China's unfair economic practices, felt very justified in imposing high tariffs on China. And then the Chinese retaliated by limiting our access to rare earths, light and heavy rare earths and magnets, right? Which the defense sector needs, the commercial manufacturing sector needs. And then the problem started. Companies really started freaking out and calling the administration, which is why I think the administration then quickly hurried, kind of got the Switzerland meeting with the Chinese to figure out if there's a path forward. Now, this is just a pause. Our trade tensions with China, we still have about 45, 50% tariffs on China. There's a 90-day pause in terms of escalating them to see if there's another deal. China in return, and this is a big, big deal, it's slowly starting to give us access to the critical minerals we need and the magnets we need. But everybody's really concerned about how long will this go on. The bottom line, Chris, and you know this well because you've lived, eat, and breathe this for so long, and I'd be interested in your take as well, and the audience certainly would, is that China, what does China want? It wants greater access to the US markets, it wants US technology, and it wants to not be constrained in its dealing with the United States and the rest of the world. It wants to continue dumping goods into the United States and steal IP, and it wants to limit our access into their markets. In return, the US wants real big structural changes in China. China, you can't continue to be a non-market economy. You have to become a developing country. You have to let us into your markets. And the reason that this is really important to understand what each country wants is that there's a likelihood that we're not going to get what we want, right? If China gives us what we want, it's really, it undermines their entire governance and economic system, right? So there might be reluctant, and then the big question is what happens after the 90-day pause? Are we going to do some type of limited deal to kind of cool tensions? And then the question is, will the status quo, is that going to be good for anybody when our critical capabilities are in China? Or is it just going to be gloves off and both countries are going to be really angry at each other? And I don't think anybody has the answer, but I think it's two pretty stubborn leaders who both feel enormous pressure to save face.
Yeah. China's a very important trading partner for recycled materials, whether it's paper or electronics, or, obviously the metals. And not all of it is direct. Some of it is now indirect. It goes to other Southeast Asian countries and it eventually makes its way to a manufacturing base within China itself. And I know in the traditional trade litigation front, even the last administration changed the laws so that it was easier to demonstrate dumping indirectly through a third party. Do you think the current administration has a plan for that, for dealing with when you negotiate with China over some sort of trade matter? How do you make sure that it's just not being transferred to another nearby country and you're not achieving your ultimate goals?
Yeah, well, much to the work that Chris, you had done, the notion of circumvention is really just sort of the top of everybody's mind. And it stems from the trade space, but also it stems a lot from the export control space. I don't think, a day or a few days go by where we don't read a story in the news about China also circumventing export controls. So circumvention is top of mind. In the trade space, there seems to be at least some interest in legislation that goes after Chinese circumvention. So one example is, China building so many plants in Mexico to benefit from USMCA. And there's been ideas about maybe we should look at the ultimate beneficial owner of these plants. And if they're Chinese and we could see that these plants have moved for circumvention purposes, we would whack them with the same tariff rate. Vietnam is really interesting because the president is among the countries that the president is looking potentially for trade deals with next. It'll probably be, India, Vietnam, maybe South Korea. And Vietnam is certainly, as we all know, a circumvention hub. So then the question is can a deal be made? And Vietnam isn't going to be able to do much about circumvention because of the extent of China's investment there, which also kind of poses some trouble for President Sheinbaum in Mexico, right? How do you elbow the Chinese out when now your economy is so dependent on them? So the circumvention issue, and the other thing I should say is when you have imbalanced tariff rates around the world, that invites sort of shopping, right, of where you're going to manufacture to take advantage of the lowest tariff rate. So I also wouldn't be surprised that a country that has a maybe low tariff rate this year and next year could get whacked with a higher rate because of how much they invite China in. So it's a legal issue and it's a factual issue and it's a trade issue that hasn't been resolved yet. There's been a lot of ideas floating around, and I think these ideas are going to continue to float around until there's a legal mechanism that's put in place that everybody agrees to. But right now, it seems a little bit haphazard because the pieces are still moving and they haven't settled for the U.S. government to get a good view on what they need to do legally to address it. Unlike, the trade laws where we are able to develop laws to deal with like a subset of issues. Now we're just talking about not just circumvention into anti-dumping, countervailing duty context, but in terms of every context. So I think this is going to be a little bit more complicated. And there's good ideas in Congress, there's good ideas in the administration, and nobody's settled on anything because they want to make sure that any proposal can really be meaningful in addressing the problem, and they're just still evaluating the options.
Yeah, you mentioned the UK deal and the China deal, and some other countries you think are next, like India and Vietnam, maybe South Korea. What about the EU? Because the EU is a major trading partner with the US. I know from my experience in negotiating the Steel 232, we had a global arrangement that we were going to negotiate, and there were various milestones that continually got kicked down the road, and now there's a new administration and everything's different. But they recently announced in the EU that as part of their retaliation against the US tariffs, they were doing a consultation, using their terminology, to evaluate a lot of different things. And one of those things is whether to impose export restrictions on scrap metal leaving the EU. So how do you think the negotiations with the EU will go? I noticed they weren't on your list of upcoming trade deals in the near term.
The president, I mean, he just doesn't like the EU. He doesn't like the EU, because of their NATO spending. He doesn't like the EU because of sort of their highbrow attitude against the United States. All of these things just irritate him. And most fundamentally, he is just enraged with the EU about their standards that prevent not only market access for our manufacturers, but I'll just give you an example. And this is one of the examples I think that's just so really forms the president's view of the EU is in autos trade, right? The EU, I mean, think about this. The EU has had standards that have prevented US auto markets from penetrating the EU market. And then when it gets into trade agreements with its trading partners, it forces them to adopt those same standards. So we're not only displaced from the EU market, now we're displaced from third country markets. And then what does the EU do when China grows in the EV space? They just open their markets to China. And China floods their marketplace with EVs, and we were always blocked. And so the president is looking at the EU like, I thought we were your friends, and you've just opened your arms in China. You've never let us in the market. And I think part of it is like very legitimate. He has a huge bone to pick with the EU. Now, our industry is going to be caught in the crossfire very much so. I think the president's going to feel enormous pressure to figure out some kind of deal with the EU. I don't think it's low-hanging fruit like some of these other countries. India offered to just eliminate all of its tariffs, right? And it's been really trying to engage with the US, and its efforts have been commendable. So the EU has threatened us with tariffs, has threatened to weaken some of our critical industries, and I think that's just irritating Trump for. So I think more. So I think EU is very much going to be sort of lower priority. Let me try to get deals with other countries first, and then see if that can pressure the EU. At the same time, EU is trying to cozy up maybe some factions of the EU closer to China, and so I think that we're going to be in a period where we might have, I'm going to give good news, maybe potentially an off-ramp in a second, but I think we're going to go into this period of tit for tat with the EU, because I just don't think that they want to budge, and I think the President Trump is really, really just angry and upset and has this sort of disdain for the way that they've been doing things. That said, I think UA may be playing this in a smart way. I think that they're flexing their muscles because they know, or they have a strong feeling, that the tariffs that President Trump had invoked using emergency powers may get enjoined at the courts. There's a lot of attorneys and within the government and outside who think that the president used the wrong legal authority to impose these global tariffs. And there's a really strong likelihood that the courts would agree. And if that happens, there's going to be a preliminary injunction on these tariffs. The separate question, Chris, is whether the administration is going to comply with the court's orders. But let's just say, assume that they do. The EU may not need to retaliate because the court has basically prevented the US's tariffs from kicking in. That gives the US at least a year and a half to 2 years to sort of litigate our tariffs through the courts. And that doesn't, I know, I'm sorry, this is getting so complicated, but the US can always pivot to another legal tool to impose the tariffs on the EU. So maybe slight reprieve, landscape is quickly changing. I do think that we should be prepared for some type of EU retaliation. And I think in the interim, could ReMA, could industries propose to the US government that there's certain sectors that are so critical to the manufacturing base that maybe those be excluded from the trade sort of tit for tats, and create these sort of like free trade corridors for certain critical capabilities, and maybe something, because of the importance to the US industry about access to the European market and bilateral trade, maybe there's a way to advocate for that. I'll tell you guys, I'm advocating for a critical minerals corridor with Canada, where that be a sector that we can't touch in terms of trade disputes, because Canada has the only viable heavy rare earth mine outside of China, and we can't jeopardize access to critical things we need for our defense industrial base because of the tit for tat. So maybe there's a way to create these critical capability corridors where we're telling the government, it's not that you can't seek corrections with other trading partners, but there's certain capabilities that you really shouldn't touch. We'll see.
That's really interesting and creative. And I think as business owners and folks in the industry, as well as the trade association ReMA, we've been thinking a lot about what should our strategy be. And businesses are being affected a lot of different ways. Some of our international trading companies, that is all they do. They trade internationally. So dealing with the tariffs and the changes and the back and forth on this has been extremely disruptive to their business. And then other companies in the association sometimes export, sometimes ship domestically, some import. So there's a whole variety, and many of them in the past have been located centrally in the country and have never seen the need to pay much attention to international trade matters. But now they're feeling the indirect effects of it, so it's really affecting all of our members in some way. So the corridor for critical type materials that are necessary for the U.S. manufacturers, what other strategies do you think ReMA should consider in dealing with all of this tariff and turmoil internationally?
So one of the things that I find pretty surprising is that unlike the first Trump administration, where at least we had companies coming in and said don't impose tariffs, and we in the government said, well, we can't not impose tariffs because we're trying to correct for things. This time around, we're not hearing about a lot of companies saying don't impose tariffs. I think they just see the writing on the wall, and I think that they see that, look, the status quo hasn't been working for America. Trump's coming in and is going to try to take it on and fix it. And yes, there will be negative consequences, repercussions, whatever, but you can't not do anything, right? The status quo isn't working, but then if you do something, there's going to be pain until you sort out what you're going to do and you're going to reach an equilibrium. So we're not seeing companies saying don't do it, but we're actually saying, what we're seeing more is companies saying, we get that you're going to do it, but do it in a smarter way. Part of it is these tariff-free corridors for critical capabilities. Some of it is saying, fine, I'm hurting, but since you're doing these big deals anyway, make country X buy more of my product, right? Some are saying, wait, don't repeal the Inflation Reduction Act because I sort of need these tax credits. In some companies who've been so disadvantaged by China's retaliation, and remember, China retaliated, so we imposed tariffs on China, and China retaliated against the United States, but China hasn't removed all of its retaliation. So we still have a number of companies that are still being hurt by China who are going behind the scenes to the administration saying, I need you to whack China harder, right? So you see all of these different sort of narratives, and as a policymaker in the government, their job is to pull all of these things together and give a cohesive solution to the government. And can you imagine how difficult that is when you have all of these competing interests? So I think as businesses, it's one, first and foremost, what is the administration trying to achieve, right? Fair trade. Two, when you're advocating for the solution, it's really important to kind of step out of the lane in which you view the world and think about other type of arguments that the government might be receiving, and then weave that into a solution. Because what the government doesn't get enough of, and I always try to let companies know, they get a lot of complaints, but they never really get good solutions. And I think the companies that come in with the really good solutions, the workable solutions, the solutions that allow the government to continue to scratch that itch, but also create economic prosperity. And this isn't easy, right? If it was easy, I think we would have all figured this out. But I think the companies who can do that are going to have the first mover advantage and are going to have their solutions baked into the policies.
So what I'm hearing is that ReMA, in its advocacy efforts, needs to come up not only with, hey, we have an issue with this policy, but provide some types of solutions to the government to say, why don't you try this? This could work. And is that through Congress? Is that through our visits to the Hill? Is that through members writing letters? Is it through meetings with government officials in the Commerce Department?
Yeah.
What's the best way for us to present solutions?
That's a great question, Chris. Everything you know about engaging with the government, you can just throw out the window, right? Because it's just, everything's changed now. And I've really never seen, and this is truly politics aside, I've never seen a leader who has gotten Congress and their parties to kind of fall completely in line with what they want, and have every global leader, when they wake up in the morning, think, how am I going to deal with Trump? Like, that's like pretty transformative, and this is completely different. So that informs the way you engage and the way you approach the administration. I think there's a lot of good people in the government right now who really want to sit with industry, roll up their sleeves, and try to figure out solutions, and want to hear solutions. And we had a really great meeting with the Commerce Department on the Copper 232, and it was really one of those very rare hour-and-a-half meetings where we were kind of talking through problems and solutions, because the government was trying to figure out, let me get as much information from ReMA as possible so I can continue to think about the options I have as solutions while trying to mitigate impact on ReMA and its members and the U.S. recycling industry, but at least trying to give the president some type of what he wants. So I think those types of engagements with the government, where you could do the formal submit comments, but really get in there and in earnest talk about issues and talk about options. And if the government throws out an option, don't just dismiss it. Think about, could that be a workable solution, and give information back, et cetera. And then I think Congress, so traditionally when people will go to Congress and have Congress issue letters or do legislation, I think Congress, the most critical role Congress can play right now is cover for the administration, right? If you want the administration to do X, Y, and Z, it's really important that Congress be supportive. And Congress not try to sort of politicize it. And Congress at some point will do what it does. But there's a lot of good people in the administration who are trying to do the right things and are trying to sort of take on both dueling objectives, which is force better trade for America, but also not hurt you at the same time. And if you are able to help the government figure out a solution and then communicate that with Congress, so Congress just doesn't get sort of too reactive and is also able to understand why the administration has to go through some steps to make your industry stronger, I think that's probably the best way. So really deep dives with the government, forthcoming conversations, work together, think of them as part of your team to kind of think of solutions, and also really try to work with Congress to give the administration as much cover as possible, because if we get into the administration and Congress fighting, we're not going to be able to change things, and right now there's just a lot of uncertainty for industry.
And ReMA has a trade committee. So I know there's many people who come to the convention who don't necessarily come to our quarterly board and committee meetings. So if there's anybody out there who has ideas that they would be willing to share, I think it would be really valuable to participate in ReMA's trade committee. And you can get in contact with Adam, or the chair is Josephita Harry. And I think it's one of the best committees that ReMA has, and we could certainly use more input from our members to come up with these creative solutions and not just complain about this and complain about that, because we're not going to get anywhere with that approach.
I'll give you, if I may, I'll give you an example. I remember in the first Trump administration when the president was imposed these tariffs on Chinese goods to retaliate against China's IP theft. And we had a big industry come in, really big, powerful industry. And it was just me in the room. And to sort of browbeat me into saying, remove these tariffs. And I said, no, I can't remove these tariffs. So I remember this one person from one of the associations, and I had posed this question, and I said, how long does it take you to move your supply chain out of China? And this gentleman said, 3 years. And I said, well, let me do this. I will give you a tariff waiver for 3 years if you can move the supply chain out of China because of the vulnerability. And you know, he was elated. Ultimately, they didn't kind of go through with it because remember, everybody at that time thought the Biden administration was going to come in and undo everything, so they just needed to wait Trump out. And the Biden administration not only didn't undo what Trump did, but really in many of the tariff levels doubled down and even increased them on China. So my point is, I think this might be a good example if you kind of go into the US government with the sense of they're going to try to be helpful and come up with solutions and work with them, let them pose questions, don't say no, but like answer them the best you can to help them come up with solutions. I think you'd be surprised to see how many solutions there are if there's just collaboration and dialogue.
That's awesome. And I think we have a lot of brilliant people that could come up with some solutions for us to share. And you're probably tired of hearing my questions, so we're at the point where I think I'd like to move into questions from the audience. So if the show producers could bring the microphones out. And before we get into that, I just want to mention, in addition to the Trade Committee, ReMA established a trade-specific webpage as part of its normal ReMA website. And also, there's special resources there, including all the webinars that Adam has done over the past couple months, and all the materials are there. And I think it's up to members and non-members for maybe one more day, and then it goes behind the wall, and it's a members-only portal. And between those updates that the Trade Association is providing to its members and the industry, and new ideas that we can generate through the Trade Committee, I think we can tackle some of these issues and maybe get some better results for industry. So now I'm going to open the floor to questions.
I guess I'll say, as folks are thinking about approaching the mic and asking questions, it's also important to remember sort of on your specific issues where the center of gravity is. The trade issues are all really being handled by Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and Peter Navarro. Those are the ones in the driver's seat. They're not all going to be on the same page when it comes to issues. It's really important, so depending on your issues, to at least tick off the Peter Navarro, Howard Lutnick engagement. And then if you want other countries to buy more of your goods and we want to export too, I think then Bessent is going to be important. But I would always socialize the issue with the non-cabinet political leadership, like the assistant secretaries and the undersecretary level. Do that feedback with them before you go to the cabinet, because you really want to get a good lay of the land before your engagement escalates. ReMA is a powerful organization. There's powerful companies that can get those CEO meetings with the cabinet members, but I can't emphasize the level of due diligence because you might not get that second bite at the apple. Certainly with the political assistant secretary, undersecretary, they'll be willing to engage a couple of times. But at the higher level, especially with Peter Navarro, he's so busy, it might not be multiple times. So that sort of grassroots due diligence is going to be really important.
We have a question.
I have a question. My name is Adam Schaefer. I work with both of you a lot and also help to scope out this panel. And we didn't talk a lot about North America, so that's partially my fault. For those in the audience that are potentially importing from Canada or Mexico as part of the IEEPA, the Emergency Border Tariff Measures, how long do we think those exemptions, those USMCA treatment might be in effect?
So I'll start with saying USMCA was sort of the crowning achievement of the first Trump administration. So it's not, I get this question, not your question, but the question of, are they going to scrap USMCA a lot? And the chances of that are pretty low and pretty much non-existent. I think everybody in the Trump administration is aware that we're going to be able to renegotiate USMCA. And I think, Adam, their interest is to try to get to a point, do some deals with countries so they can get a better lay of the land to then accelerate. And I think they're going to want to accelerate the USMCA negotiations. They have to, the government has to signal, all of our governments, Canada, US, and Mexico, that they want to renegotiate USMCA by July of next year. I think they're going to try to do that a little bit earlier. So I think ultimately these tariffs are going to be removed while we have a better USMCA. And I think, look, the government has said this numerous times that their priority is to get better rules that bring more manufacturing into the United States. I think they were really stunned by how much production went to Mexico, and they want to not make that mistake again, and they want to actually correct that. But the practical challenges are that companies just can't, you can't just pick up a multi-million, billion-dollar manufacturing plant and move it around every few years. And so I think it's going to be, I think that they're going to try to figure out how much they can bring here and then be more proactive in how they look at these rules to make sure that they get the U.S. advantage. But to make the answer a little bit more succinct, I don't think USMCA is going to go away. I don't think they have any desire to, but they're going to try to rebalance it in U.S.'s favor where they think that they may have made some mistakes before, although they'll never admit that there were mistakes, maybe.
Brian.
Hi, Nazak. Hi, Chris. I'm looking at the long game here, right? We're at the beginning stages of the tariffs, and if successful, and we increase our manufacturing bases here in the U.S., has the administration taken any steps, or is the administration communicating, addressing? How do we find the individuals and the people to staff these new jobs in the manufacturing sector?
So that's a really good question. So when I work with sort of some of the technical electronic companies, it's fascinating because like in semiconductors, you hear that we don't have the skilled workforce, but a lot of the companies are partnering with the local universities or locating in areas where there's a university nearby. They're partnering with them. They're creating this sort of flow of trained people that can enter their companies. But I think part of it is sort of this chicken or egg problem, right? Why would you go to school and get an education in something you're not going to have a job for, right? So I think it starts with bringing manufacturing here. There's a lot of universities that are really psyched about maybe a resurgence of manufacturing, and they're trying to predict what things they need to focus the curriculum on. So I think they're taking their own initiatives to start mapping out where they need to focus education on. And I think it's going to be an issue that after a little bit of which comes first will sort of balance itself out. But one thing that it relates to your question is on the investor side. Because the US hasn't been doing manufacturing in so many sectors for so long, investors lost the ability to evaluate investments in manufacturing. They now are just so caught up in software and AI investment, but what about the brick and mortar manufacturing? So I think in addition to sort of workforce education, there's a huge amount that needs to be done in investor education. And how do you get investors to care about an industry? Then that comes to signaling by the US government, which is why I think some of these executive orders are so important. They're a signaling tool that lets the government and investors know that we care about this industry. We want investments to go into this industry. We want universities to focus curriculum on this industry. And once these industries are functioning or strong or get even stronger, we're going to take the measures in the US government to protect those industries.
Thanks, Brian. What other questions can we answer? Or at least try to answer. Sir.
I'm a believer in what I think Trump is trying to do, if it all works out the way we expect it to. I think the challenge is, and he's got 3.5 years left in office under his administration. What happens after that? There's a huge investment for these companies to bring, their manufacturing centers back to the United States, and if all that works, who's to say the next administration doesn't just turn that back to what we've been doing the past 20 years? And what tools are there that he can implement to prevent that from happening?
That's why I think it's a really good question, because I think a lot of people are saying, why is he moving so hard, so fast? Because I think he understands that he needs to start the process now so the things stick. So the onshoring, once the onshoring happens, right, nobody's going to undo it. Now you're faced with industries that you're going to have to do something to protect. So let's say Trump's initiatives on, let's say, critical minerals and semiconductors are really successful, and we can bring a lot of semiconductor manufacturing back into the United States, and we can bring critical mineral processing and magnet making back into the United States. And his term ends. Well, now, and let's say, the party switches in the executive branch. This is much like what we saw happen in the Trump to Biden. Now that you have manufacturing here, or now that the steel and aluminum industry with the 232s were strengthened, you've inherited a thing that you can't undermine. So we see these things where one administration, once industry moves, and they do things to get industries to move, the other administration has no choice but to protect those industries, because the supply chains and the manufacturing base and the investments have already occurred. So I think Trump's moving as hard as he can to get as much done this year as possible, and he seems to have gotten a lot of commitments, financial commitments in domestic investments. And let's say Gavin Newsom or somebody wins the next election, he's going to have no choice but to protect those industries and prevent predatory import competition from undermining them. So I think every administration is going to institute policies that the next one is going to build off of. And if it's small and it's not disruptive to rip it up, they will. But these big ticket items like supply chain and manufacturing bases, they're going to have to take measures, similar measures to protect.
Thank you. Yes?
So to kind of piggyback on what Brian said, a lot of the reason manufacturing left is the cost of labor and labor regulations. And I'm from the HR perspective, and the amount of administrative work that we have to do to comply with everything, it's really not surprising that companies packed up and left. So I know this is kind of a tangent from the trade and tariffs, but the reality is that if the ultimate goal is to bring manufacturing back, there's a lot of hurdles that have to be removed to make that, solvent and solulent on the long run. Other words, it's a lot of investment for no achievement at the end. And so is there a labor perspective that's being brought in to also weigh these options?
That's a great question. Labor is another area where policymakers don't spend a lot of time thinking about, and some of these issues you mentioned, I think they're thinking about permitting and how onerous that is, but they're not talking about sort of these labor issues. So on one hand, if we're bringing manufacturing here, let's just say on the workforce and wages alone, we're going to have just a disparity from what other countries can do. And we're going to have to change a lot of our laws that will still allow us to have a manufacturing base here, even though another country can do it cheaper, because critical capabilities we just need to have in this country. And so how do you kind of create there's ways to do it, but they're going to have to tackle that problem. That's just a sort of one layer is wages. And then all of these other sort of regulatory hurdles that are increasing the cost for businesses, I really think this is something. I think you touched on something really important. I think this is something the administration should start considering and look at it through a similar prism in which they've looked at environmental regulations and deregulating and thinking of other creative solutions to the problem. So I think you should advocate to the executive branch something like an executive order or some policy with what you envision makes sense for them to do, and kind of set this conversation in motion, because it really isn't on their radar, but I think it's fascinating that you're identifying that as being a problem in getting our manufacturing base up and running.
I just wanted to piggyback a little bit on both Yvette's and Brian's comment. Also wanted to say we lost an awful lot of manufacturing from states like Illinois and Michigan and the old Rust Belt states, not to foreign countries, but we lost them because of self-inflicted wounds to states like Tennessee and other places that had more liberal labor regulations. But my comment is, we can train people till have universities train people till the cows come home, but where are we going to get the bodies?
Where are we going to get
the bodies, the people?
The buyers for?
The bodies, the people.
The bodies.
Humans to actually do the work that we need.
Right, because we're basically at full employment now.
Yeah. So that's another really important issue. We're going to have much more demand on energy, on infrastructure, on people than we've ever imagined before. So I think on some level, I think the administration, I think they're just trying to bring as much, there's so much with respect to the economics and dynamic of every industry, and they just don't have the time to analyze it, and I think even if anybody analyzes it, you're always just going to miss elements anyway. So they're just trying to, throw tariffs onshore as much as possible, let the market decide what's going to be onshore. But then to your point, we can't support every manufacturing sector that we want here, which is why I think it's really important that this USMCA or issues with Canada and Mexico be sorted out, because we need Canada's land mass, we need their workforce, we need their energy too if we're going to do this, and certainly Mexico. So the U.S. can certainly not do it alone, and I think the administration recognizes that on some level. At the same time, it's fair that they're trying to onshore as many critical capabilities as possible. But I think this is why our trade agreements with allies are going to be so important, why USMCA is going to be so important, and I envision that these trade agreements are also going to have provisions where we will commit to continue to supply one another and then shield those critical capabilities that we rely on Mexico for, rely and mandate that the Mexican government shield those critical sectors from predatory import competition, because it doesn't make sense if we put some critical capabilities somewhere else and then China just decimates those industries tomorrow. I think that's the direction they're going to move in, but I think when I say that's the direction they're moving in, that implicitly acknowledges that they know, although they won't say, that all manufacturing can't come here.
I really understand the three questions that were related to where we're going to get the people to run the plants. I just got back from Taiwan, and I was talking to some people from a semiconductor manufacturer there, and they said, yeah, there's a big plant being built in Arizona, and they're trying to get workers from Taipei to go to Arizona, and nobody wants to go. And they're having to pay them extremely high wages to get them to go because there's not enough workers, and the type of workers, those relationships with the universities to supply the high-tech trained workers, so they're having to train people. And let's face it, Americans are a little more independent in how they want to do things, and when there's 792 steps to make a chip, and at every step somebody says, why don't we do it this way? It's been a little bit frustrating for a different type of manufacturing. So there are some challenges, and I think probably some of the big thinkers in the government initiating these policies to have the laudable goal to bring manufacturing back aren't considering some of these issues, and we need to raise them as part of our efforts, but we also need to come up with some solutions. So I think we need to spend some time on that. Workforce development solutions, and I know ReMA has some workforce development groups that are trying to address those very same questions today for our facilities today where we need workers. But very good questions. Sir.
Thank you. First, thank you for your time, making yourself available to us. I have a comment and a couple of questions, I guess, is that one of the things that you talked about, like a skilled workforce and maybe increasing wages and accepting the higher costs. I think that like there's the model that Germany had of having like a skilled workforce and workforce placement kind of programs instead of just a traditional, liberal college education in terms of like guiding them to, things like that. I think that's something that the U.S. is going to have to consider. I just want to ask, you mentioned executive orders and the president working fast to make things happen. But what do you think the odds are that he could get Congress more involved to actually legislate some of like the changes to labor laws and things like that to make those kinds of things stick rather than just enforcing all these executive orders that are going to get challenged legally, like you said, they're going to get tied up in litigation for a year or two. What are the odds that Congress can actually, they've abdicated a lot of their roles to the president, to the executive branch. What do you think the odds are that they could actually do something like that?
Yeah, that's such a great question because we just recently saw a model of exactly what you're talking about in an unrelated sector, but it's a great model. Right now it seems that because in the executive branch, all options on the table, and these folks want to move and solve and deregulate and figure all this stuff out, I think there's a huge opportunity for creative thinking and getting laws issued through an executive order. What recently happened in this deep sea mining space is that there was no law to sort of make this a priority. The president issued an executive order, and now there is a proposal that Congress take the executive order and make it a law, right? And there was also the SHIPS Act where there was legislation floating around, and the executive branch took it and said, we're not going to wait for Congress, we're going to turn as much of it into an executive order for shipbuilding as possible. So I think just depends on what everybody is experiencing and where you think and what the issue is and where you think you have momentum. You can always try Congress, but I think another maybe shortcut could be have the executive branch issue an executive order and then work with Congress, because now that it's out and people are doing it, it'll be easier for Congress to adopt it into law, as long as it's not controversial and folks seem to agree on it. But even things right now with the climate in Congress that seem to be not controversial, it's just so slow. So it might just be a faster way to do it.
I think we have a question over here first, and then we'll get to you, sir.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, Chris. Hi, Nazak. Thank you for what you have provided us so far. This may be overly simplistic. The administration wants manufacturing to come back, meaning manufacturing was here before, it left, and now they want it to come back. Do they know that manufacturing needs raw materials? And we're here, we're still here, and we hope to be still around, right? So we are an industry that has always existed, whether manufacturing is in the country or left the country, and we've been providing raw materials for the industry, whatever has existed, and also other manufacturers in other parts of the world. Does the administration know that we exist and we are part of the equation? If they don't know, what do we need to do for them to like see us as essential as we are? And that we've existed and we will continue to exist.
Yeah, so I think this is every administration, it kind of takes for granted the things that are fine, because if it's, I mean, in a way, fine is relative, but if it's fine, you don't need to fix it, and you're sort of hyper-focused on the things you don't have, or if something's broken. But I think that also the administration tends to lose focus on some of the crown jewels, right, that it already has. And so Chris and I were just talking about how to get the recycling industry onto the government's radar is so essential to supporting the manufacturing base, the defense industrial base, the commercial industrial base, because everything the government cares about, the economic security and national security, it begins and ends with the health of the domestic industrial base. And now, here's the advantages. Now folks are talking and caring about the upstream raw materials that go into supporting it. And what they haven't really talked about, I think in this administration in a very meaningful way, is how the recycling industry is so integral, because Chris and I were just talking about it. Once it's produced, what do you do with it when it needs to be at the end of its life cycle or decommissioned or whatever? And then how do you have access to more feedstock, right? And it really underpins all the critical capabilities that we're trying to do. So it is really important for the administration to not only understand its importance, but understand some of the nuances of the industry, to understand that I can't touch this. An industry that the administration understands really well right now is semiconductors. So if you talk about sort of any issue with the energy grid or batteries or autos, they understand how the semiconductors play into this. And in a way, semiconductor is an upstream component too, right, in any of these things. It would be awesome if the recycling industry kind of got that level of education in the US government, so they had that level of detailed knowledge about any other policy industry, how it would impact the recycling industry. So it's a really good idea, and
it's our challenge. It's definitely our challenge, and I think we need to do that in a lot of different ways and continue to do that. I think we have time for one last question. Sir.
Hi. My question is, Trump was elected with the belief he would bring down pricing. Are there any consideration that bringing manufacturing back to the US will have the opposite effect, like, you know, due to higher labor, higher energy costs?
Yeah. So who remembers about 20, 30 years ago, right? This is what I keep trying to remind people. Our industrial base has been steadily eroding for decades, but there was a period where we did have some resilient industries and things weren't crazy expensive, right? People could afford what they needed. And I want to add to that, there was a time where not only did we have an industrial base, but one person in the family had to work, and they made enough money to put food on the table for their children and their family and supply their kids. And the reason I'm saying all this is because I think there's going to be an equilibrium. We are going to bring manufacturing back, and with manufacturing back, we're going to increase wages. And with increased wages, right, we're going to get to an equilibrium where things aren't going to appear so expensive because wages have increased and we have other policy issues in place to support it. What I do want to really underscore is that with the steady erosion of our manufacturing base has been steady wage suppression or depression, depending on industries. And we are in a situation now where in some of these rural communities, the average mother and father have to work multiple jobs to keep food on the table for their children. So this sort of global exposure, and I don't want to say globalism is bad, I think fair trade is important, but I do think that our nation needs to also protect some critical industries, because we have gone to a period where if any country can produce it cheaper, and I'm going to just say this really quickly, like our dumping laws, essentially, if I'm going to oversimplify it, but it's very true. If any country can produce it cheaper than the United States, we don't deserve to have the industry. That's really what our laws say, right? So I'm not surprised that we've had the erosion of our manufacturing base and wages have gotten lower and lower and lower. How are we going to pay anybody anything if Vietnam, their complete economic structure is different? So there's a lot of policy reconfiguring that has to happen to get to this point. But I think that there's a lot of merit to getting to that point, because if we've advanced technologically, but if you kind of just think about relatively, with especially China's entry into the World Trade Organization, is America economically and militarily on the world stage more prominent and powerful now, and are wages healthier now versus before China's entry into the WTO? And if the answer is we were healthier and more powerful economically and the wages were better before China's entry into the WTO, then it stands to reason to study how that has distorted wages in the manufacturing base, and then what policies do we need to reconfigure to get it to where it was, establish an equilibrium so things don't appear relatively more expensive, and parents can just work one job and not multiple ones to barely make ends meet. They can work one job and have a healthy, good income to support their families.
That's a good goal. Well, our time is up. I want to thank Nazak. I know how busy you are. I know you're flying out early in the morning to Ottawa, Canada to speak at the G7. So we really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today. Thank you to the audience for coming, the great questions, and for your attention. Thank you very much.